Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's August 15, 2023, and today we are talking with Dr. Stephen Campbell, Assistant Professor in the School of Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Stephen is an anthropologist, theorist and critic of capitalism, and an expert on Burmese labour. His publications range widely in these areas, and keen listeners may remember our Myanmar Musings conversation about his last book, Border Capitalism Disrupted, about 2.5 years ago. We talked. We're here because Stephen has a new book titled Along the Integral Margin, Uneven Development in a Myanmar Squatter Settlement. It's one of these terrific books, I think, that is concise about Myanmar, but also about the world and the things that the fortunate take for granted, and some discomforting truths about economic life. Hello, Stephen.
Thank you for having me, Luke. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And as I said, your previous book, it focused on Burmese migrant workers in Mae Sot, actually, which is a Burma-Thailand border town, and their daily struggles under an unjust labour regime that keeps them toiling in precarious conditions. And Mae Sot remains such a place. In Along the Integral Margin, your new book, you're instead firmly focused on a part of the largest city in Myanmar, Yangon. And you begin your book with a really very tragic story about a man named Zorlin U, who was a skilled fisher, but at the time of his death, a collector of plastic, when he was murdered by a stranger on the street. This stranger had family connections to the local government office and got off scot-free. Why do you start your book with this story? And where is this place? What is this new geographic subject of the book? What kind of place did this murder take place in?
Okay, well, first for the location, I've kept the specific township anonymous, but it's one of the industrial zones on the outskirts of Yangon. And I was researching at a squatter settlement or an informal settlement within one of these industrial zones. So in the case in question, the book opens with the story of Zolanu, who was a resident of this informal settlement and was a waste collector, an individual who had a cart and would go out with his family and collect plastics and other things that people had discarded on the side of the road and then resell them. So it's definitely a very tragic story because he was collecting plastics and went close to someone's shop, and the owner of the shop got angry at him, accused him of stealing an item, and ended up stabbing him, and he died. It's a tragic story, and the reason that I opened the book with that, well, there are actually two reasons, I think. So the first is that when I returned to the settlement in 2019, I'd only made periodic visits before that, but 2019 is when I did the bulk of my research. And when I returned in 2019, the very first day that I returned to the settlement at the start of 2019, an activist friend who I knew, a woman who had previously been living in the settlement, she had recently moved out. She was taking me around and introducing me to some people. And the very first home she took me to was the family of Zolanu. And she told me, this is a very important story. You have to hear about what had happened. I was taken to this house and spoke with his parents, and his parents as well were understandably distraught, but also frustrated at the lack of response by the police about the case. So that's one of the main reasons why I opened the book with that. But in addition, Zolanu's story really encapsulates well many of the problems of the standard transition narrative, or this transition thesis, which the World Bank and other political actors were promoting in Myanmar. So it's a very dramatic story and a tragic story, but it does really encapsulate many of these facets. So Zolanu was a rural dweller, as you mentioned. He was a fisher, but his fishing livelihood was taken away from him because of the economic transition when the fishing zones, the fishing ponds and lakes were privatized. So him and his family were pushed out of the rural areas because they had no more livelihood, and they went to the urban area. They went around Yangon, hoping to get waged employment. The types of employment he could get was very precarious, which is why he ended up having to collect plastics. And because their income was so low, they were effectively priced out of the formal housing or rental market. So that's how they ended up in the squatter settlement. His livelihood as a collector was very uncertain and very vulnerable and very precarious. So he does not exemplify the kind of ideal figure of the transition narrative, somebody who sees the bright lights and economic boom of the city and goes there and gets some good formal sector job and is kind of moving up in the world. I think that's the story that was really sold to the people of Myanmar and to others who were following developments in the country by, again, figures like the World Bank and other proponents of the transition narrative. So in that way, his story really exemplifies the fraught elements of this so-called transition.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that comes through in the book the further that you read. And you call this location in the book Yadana. That's the pseudonym that you use. And although you do some very in-depth ethnographic fieldwork and oral history work as your methodology, you also do a survey. So could you maybe just give us a little overview, although you want to keep the place anonymous? What kind of place is this from a demographic, geographic point of view?
There were about 1,000 households and about 4,000 residents. They were these homes were mostly initially bamboo and deni palm constructions that were built on 3 sites that were designated for factory construction in the industrial zone. So initially there were people who were working as porters along the river who were living in very cramped dormitories at the trade depots, and they moved out of those depots and built these bit more spacious bamboo and deni palm homes. And gradually over the years, it increased the population, especially after Cyclone Nargis, when there were many people who were displaced from the Delta and came to Yangon. They didn't have a lot of resources, couldn't get or afford rental accommodation, and therefore moved into the settlement. And so by the time that I did my research there, mostly in 2019, there was again about 4,000 people. The labor that people did was primarily, there was waste collection was very prominent. So too was unloading and loading of ships at various depots along the riverside. There were many young women who were employed in the garment factories. And there were also a smaller number of people who did various other occupations like catching eels to sell to eel merchants, or people who had access to a truck who would purchase wood shavings from a lumber mill and sell it to a cardboard factory, which was used, the wood shavings were used in the boiler to make. So these are the kind of a wide range of these sort of ad hoc livelihoods that were practiced there.
And when talking about this place and the people that live there, you contextualize that with scholarly debates about capitalism and labor, your overall research interest. But you also you take time to point out the pernicious elements of modernisation theory and its legacy in Myanmar. During this time of change between roughly 2010 to the time of the coup, there are many junctures and opportunities for things to change in ways that they hadn't for some time in Myanmar, from the top and from the bottom. And you say that modernisation theory is not just a flawed development paradigm, but it's an ideological claim that's deployed to oppose progressive calls for a redistribution of wealth and power. So in Myanmar, what do you mean here? How is this, it's an old idea, but still powerful idea, influenced Myanmar's economy and politics? And why is it so hard for elites to break free from?
Great question. So I think there were 2 main reasons for this. So the first is that when the transition started, there were various international financial institutions and foreign governments and Western-trained economic advisors who were all telling various political figures in Myanmar, including in the USDP, the military-backed USDP, as well as in the subsequent NLD government, that the only option for Myanmar was a foreign investment driven extractivist export economy. And so all other alternative development approaches were very much marginalized. There were other approaches proposed, for example, emphasizing small scale agriculture. However, it was presented as though the only viable option was this foreign investment driven extractivist export economy. So there was this very big kind of ideological push coming in. However, at the same time, a second reason is that this form of economic, this agenda, this development paradigm of a foreign investment-driven extractivist export economy in Myanmar, it did in fact benefit local economic and political elites. including in the people in the military, in the USDP, and in the NLD. So it's not that nobody in Myanmar benefited from this. However, it was these elites. And so they had an incentive to embrace this model. And in doing so, they sought to create what kind of a so-called welcoming environment for foreign investment. And this meant enabling, for example, investment in land, foreign investment in land, as well as restricting worker mobilizing that risked scaring away foreign investment. So you had these local elites who were benefiting from this modernization theory-based economic agenda who were complicit in cracking down on student mobilization, farmer mobilization, worker mobilization. So we had both factors from outside the country and from inside the country that were working together to advance this economic agenda.
And your book is about fundamentally labour in this environment. And I thought maybe we could ask a direct question about the title of your book, because on first read, it may not necessarily. The subtitle is a much simpler thing to digest than the actual title, Along the Integral Margin. This concept, this idea of an integral margin, sort of seems self-contradictory when you just think about it abstractly, depending on your unit of your analysis. So in your book, if I understand it correctly, the margin that you refer to is the value of the labour of the people in your field site, your research participants, and who those people represent more broadly. And your fieldwork is going along this margin. But can we draw a line under all of this? So what is this margin separating, defining, and what's it integral to?
So in the transition narrative, the argument was that there would be this shift from rural agrarian livelihoods to urban formal employment. And so under the so-called transition, urban dwellers who were eking out a living through precarious informal livelihoods or wage labor were deemed to be not yet transitioned. They were not exemplifying what the transition was supposed to be pointing to. So they were seen to be outside of the modern Myanmar that was going to emerge under this so-called transition. So in that sense, they were seen to be not integral to the modern Myanmar. However, I am trying to push back on this argument to say that, in fact, the informal livelihoods, labor of the individuals in the settlement were, in fact, intimately imbricated with the urban capitalist economy, so that this so-called modern sector is, in fact, dependent on this very precarious informal economy that is existing side by side. So in that way, the informal economy is very much integral. It's marginal, however, in an ideological and political sense, in that it was deemed to be outside and not part of the modern economy of the transitioning Myanmar. So we had this kind of ironic incorporation economically at the same time that there was this political exclusion and ideological exclusion of the individuals that I was researching. So I wanted to push back on this claim that these people were not exemplifying the kind of the emerging Myanmar of the transition, and to say instead that they were central to and integral to the modern economy in urban Yangon.
Thank you. That's a really great summary to that question, and outlines what a crucial contribution your book has been and is. Another reason why I really enjoyed this work is that you have written, I think, one of the best summaries of internal migration in Myanmar, recent internal migration. And this is partly because of your interest to keep dispossession at the center of what you write about. When I was living in Burma and I was there while you were doing the research, I used to always say to people that there just isn't enough research, there isn't enough information about internal migration. There's so much written about Burmese people going to Thailand and going to Malaysia and places like that. But it was very clear that there was so much movement going on within the country that the research was lagging. Now, even if you just restricted the frame to the central regions, not the outer states, could you describe? You've already sort of mentioned some of the reasons when we're talking about Zulin U. Could you describe how this is really changed since 1988 in particular, this internal migration, and then after 2010. How does it work? What are the push and pull and structural factors? And you also note acute crises. And then, maybe you could tie it together by talking about how it sort of created your field site from nothing.
Sure. So for better or for worse, pre-1988, the policies of the BSPP, the Burma Socialist Program Party, the military-backed government at the time, effectively kept the price of land relatively low and inhibited, for example, foreign investment in land. And so these combined to reduce the both investment in land, but also to stave off what later became this large-scale land grab that was not just present in Myanmar, but in many countries in the global south. So after 88, which is in fact when the economic transition really began, although the transition is often seen and talked about as though it began at 2010 or 2011, it was 88 that was really the moment when the military authorities, the government at the time, turned to what we might call a neoliberal model. And one aspect of this was to, for example, open up investment in land and exports. And this had a huge impact on increasing the price of land, of agricultural land and rural land. So, of course, some people benefit from it. So landowners would benefit from that. But it also stimulated large-scale land grabs, non-compensated land grabs by the military and various business cronies. So the large-scale land grabbing in Myanmar that happened after 1988 has been quite well documented. And this is something that continued even into the so-called transition. So even after 2011, when the first quasi-civilian elected government came in, and even into the NLD's period of government, these land grabs continued. In addition, though, there was significant loss of consolidation of rural land, where smallholders lost land due to market mechanisms, including debt. So there has been since 88 in particular, a significant consolidation of rural land. Much of this has been turned into mines and plantations and large-scale fish farms, which are often not as labor-consuming as smallholder farms. This is especially true with things like oil palm plantations. So as a result, many former smallholders and other people in the rural economy, for example, independent fishers, because during the so-called socialist era, there were collective fishing pools at many villages. So these sorts of things were privatized as well. And for this reason, many people were no longer able to access these rural livelihoods and therefore were pushed out of their former rural areas. They largely sought work at, for example, mines, in some cases plantations, in some cases at large-scale fish farms, or at newly emerging industrial zones in around Yangon, for example, and these were introduced after 88. So the township where I did research was effectively created after 88, both to house relocated former residents of downtown Yangon, but also as spaces for these new factories that were anticipated. And so largely this was a push factor from rural areas, but there was also, we could call it a pull factor, or at least the view that there was an option in terms of employment. However, the promise of wage employment, especially formal, well-paid wage employment, has not in practice delivered on the promise of the transition. So we have people who are migrating to the cities, but instead of being incorporated into, for example, waged factory employment, although there was an increase in waged factory employment, but the bulk of people who moved to the cities, in fact, were not getting access to that because in the garment sector, which was the largest of these kind of waged factory employment sectors, that was largely restricted to young women in their late teens and early 20s. Men were effectively barred from that employment. This is some of the dynamics of the rural to urban migration. And internal migration, as you say, I don't have the figures on hand, but has been significantly higher than out-migration to Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, and whatnot. This was captured in the census during the transition. So you have this expansion of the urban population, and because of the increase the spike in real estate values in urban areas, in large part because of real estate speculation. These new arrivals in the urban areas who left the rural areas could not afford, definitely not to buy property, but in many cases, not even to rent formally an accommodation. And so as a result, we had this explosion of these informal settlements around Yangon. It was something like 500,000 people were residing in these informal settlements by the end of this, just before the coup. And their situation is very much a phenomenon of this kind of post-88 economic transformation that continued with what's more commonly referred to as a transition from 2011 to 2021.
Thanks. Yeah. And I thought something that shocked me was just how selective the garment industry is, as you mentioned, to one gender and a very narrow band there, when the garment industry is kind of the poster child for modernization theory or for analyses and descriptions given outside the country. I was also struck on the gender angle. I've read some accounts from women who worked in these factories who talked about the industrial action. Even though the entire workforce was women, often it would be men who would come in to lead their industrial action, which just seems absurd.
Just to follow up there, that may be the case in some cases, but definitely there are, and there have been, and there still are many impressive women labor organizers in the industrial zones around Yangon. And a lot of the big actions that I was privy to while I was there, and that I followed afterwards, have been led by women, including notably the February 6th street protests after the coup were led by women garment workers from the industrial zones.
Okay, and now you've sort of you haven't used the word so much yet in your book. Though it's there quite a lot. The word is squatting. So when this field site, this location, Yarana, was born from internal migration, the process in which this happened is sometimes called squatting. So you can define that as the illegal occupation of lands or something like that. So your book is very helpful to understanding just what squatting is within capitalism in Myanmar. You know, in an Australian settler colonial perspective, squatting is a very romantic notion. I was brought up and educated with this settler culture of my home country. But that is obviously completely false. And so what does this sort of parochial romantic view that people like me grew up with, or a view that squatting operates in some enduring way outside of capitalism or regulation, what does that get wrong? How is squatting riven with contradictions in Yangon?
Well, so definitely a lot of the writing that comes out of the more kind of politically assertive squatters movement in the global north, and especially in Europe, often emphasizes the possibilities of creating this space outside of capitalism, often a democratic and egalitarian non-capitalist space. So that's some of the writing I was kind of pushing back against. Not so much, I can't speak to the squatters movement in Europe. It's not something I've had experience with, but definitely in the Myanmar case, and I would argue in much of the global south, squatting is a tactic that's used to address very kind of immediate livelihood, precarious livelihood concerns of people. To find ways to find accommodation without going through the highly expensive formal housing or real estate market. At the same time, however, definitely not in the case that I looked at. This is not outside of capitalism, because the people who were living at this settlement were very much incorporated into capitalist processes. Many of them were wage laborers. There were women who were working in the garment factories, and these garment factories were producing garments for export to international markets. I mean, these are big name brands like Zara and Adidas and Gap, and yet some of the labor force is living in squatter settlements. Other ways in which they're incorporated into capitalism is through debt relations, where people are taking on debt from creditors outside of the settlement. Other forms of livelihood that seem to be something like self-employment are in fact incorporated through debt relations, as though there's something like waged labor. So for example, there were individuals living in the settlement who were collecting trapping wild eels, and they grow in Myanmar in these sort of stagnant urban pools of water. And now this seems like it's something like a non-capitalist form of self-employment, where you have somebody living in this informal settlement who traps their own eels with a trap that they have. However, these individuals, in order to pursue this livelihood, had to borrow significant amounts of money from eel merchants who would pay for not only the traps, but also the motorcycle to transport the eels. And as a result, the eel trappers were in significant debt to the merchant, and they were obligated to sell all of the eels that they trapped to that specific merchant. So they could not go to someone else, even if someone else was offering a higher price. But also, because of the debt relation, the merchant could then say, you're not allowed to take a break. You owe me this money. You have to get out there and work. So the creditor became like an employer. And so these are various ways in which these squatters, who might seem at kind of a superficial level to be somehow outside of the kind of capitalist market economy, are in fact very much incorporated into capitalist relations in various ways.
Thank you. And now you've mentioned debt, which is another important part of your overall argument. And I have to say, there are some very sad stories in the book, and in good anthropology, they come out and they catch you by surprise. One example is you write that the childhood of Sister Myat, as a physically abused and debt-bound domestic servant pressed into employment by her family, was in no way exceptional in Myanmar. And it's true. If you've spent time in Myanmar, you know that this statement is true, but it still, packs a powerful punch. So how did your research participants deal with debt? It was also part of the internal migration that you talk about. And you've mentioned there how it's sort of transformed relations into a sort of employer relationship. But you also write that it's the terms that you use in your book is that it's disciplinary and extractive.
Well, I should say that first, some of the stories that I've included, which are definitely very, very difficult stories, very tragic in certain ways. Although I want to humanize the individuals I'm writing about, but there's a risk in doing that we might lose sight of these structural factors that are shaping their lives. So in the case in question that you mentioned with Sister Myat, I'd actually known her parents relatively well. I only interviewed her after she was an adult. But I spoke with her and her parents, and they had at the time, a healthy relationship. She was visiting them, and they definitely cared for her. But the economic conditions were such that people are forced to make very difficult choices. So it's not the case that somehow people are unethical and they just sell their children off to a creditor. That's not really the case. It's more the case that people are in very difficult situations and they're making these very difficult choices that they otherwise would not want to do. So that's important, despite my attempt to humanize these stories by emphasizing the kind of the individual agency of people. Now, the way that debt operates disciplinarily is that when people take on debt, especially because the debt or the credit that they have access to is very high interest. And this means that there's a lot of pressure to repay quickly. And often people do not have the collateral, other forms of collateral. So for example, children in this case, working off the debt, are kind of in serving as an alternative to having large collateral to borrow. So for example, I mentioned the eel trappers who would take on this large debt from eel merchants, and the eel merchant could then in turn say, okay, you're not allowed to take a break. You've got to deliver to me, and you've got to sell to me, even if somebody else is offering a better price. So what might seem like a form of self-employment is in fact working like a wage relation. Some of the cases of child labor that I looked at include one young man who was working at a tea shop since the age of, I believe it was 9. And his father would come and collect these advances. So the employer, the owner of the tea shop, would pay the wages, several months' wages, directly to the father. So no money, in fact, passed through the hands of the child. And the father would go there every several months to collect the advance, and then the child would work off this debt. And so the employer could then use the fact of this debt as a way to discipline these young workers, these child workers, by saying, like, look, you can't leave, you have this debt. And as a result, there's a significant amount of child labor in Myanmar. A lot of it is bonded in the sense that parents are getting advances on the child's labor. And it's often very dangerous forms of work. Another extreme case is with the raft fishers off the coast of the Piabon in the Delta, who take advances for 8 months of their labor. They get a small advance of maybe 600,000, 700,000 kyat, which is not actually that much money. And they would get this advance, and then they'd have to go out and live on this raft for 8 months doing this fishing work. And the rafts were very brutal. There was a lot of violence, malnutrition, but they had taken this advance. And so unless they're somehow capable of repaying that advance in full, otherwise they're not able to leave the job until it's over, until the 8 months of work is over. So these are several of the ways in which debt is acting to enable a very disciplinary form of labor.
And sometimes, you write, people arrive to Yadanar from very far away with pre-existing significant debt as well.
Yes, definitely. So, yeah.
This is a little bit of an aside question, my personal interest, but in one of your chapters, you dwell briefly on the betel industry. And you call the consumption of carcinogenic betel quids a staple of working class life and part of Burma's culturally specific social reproduction process, which is similar to what Marx said about the reliance on beer in Britain and wine in France back in the 19th century. There's also a great article by Anthony Reid, a Southeast Asia historian, where he talks about the shift that happened in Indonesia from betel chewing to cigarette smoking. And I'm in Indonesia right now, and there is no betel being chewed on the island that I'm in. Now, Myanmar has not seen such a shift. Both are still hugely indulged in, especially by what you could call them working class men. And in my fieldwork, I saw how people with formal sort of waged company type jobs did sort of stop using betel, or they started using it more surreptitiously. And some men hid it from their wives, told their wives, I don't do it anymore, but then they did it in secret. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about your observations about betel quid. Firstly, what is social reproduction? And then what are your thoughts about betel consumption in your field site?
Okay, really interesting question. I think what you're saying seems to make sense to me. Of course, most of the people that I was doing research with were kind of working class people in informal or low-wage employment, and those kinds of pressures for a kind of urban middle-class respectability maybe were not really there. So I definitely betel consumption was very high among the people I was doing research with. There was no evident pressure on people to hide it or to reduce consumption. Even I think concerns about health related to that did not seem very common, at least in my conversations with people. Now, social reproduction refers to the process of reproducing. Most broadly, it's about reproducing capitalism and everything that's needed to reproduce capitalism, including the infrastructure of capitalism. However, more recently, the concept of social reproduction has been used to refer to the labor and the process of reproducing the workers for capitalism. So social reproduction theory often focuses on the labor of the unpaid or low-paid labor of women who take care of children and families. But we can also talk about food as a necessary part of reproducing the worker, who will then go out to the factory and work for the capitalist, who then profits off of this worker's labor. So in that sense, just eating every day is part of social reproduction, but where we have these kind of culturally specific forms of consumption, like beer in the UK or wine in France or betel in Myanmar, we can see this as this is something that many of the workers that I interviewed felt this is a staple. This is something they need to that they definitely want, but also in many cases are relying on, just as, smokers would find it maybe difficult. People who are heavy smokers find it very difficult to go and continue a very, laborious job without having a smoke break. So I had actually some pushback on this line of this argument from one commentator who was saying that, well, betel consumption has long predated capitalism in Myanmar. So, it's misleading to say, or mistaken to say that this is somehow part of the capitalist reproduction. However, this is also the case with this food. I mean, people have been eating food since before capitalism. However, we still need to feed workers who then go out to the factory. So food becomes part of social reproduction, just like beer and wine in the UK and France, respectively. So definitely, it seems like I think we can make the case that betel consumption is a really important part of working class life and working class labor in Myanmar.
And as a stimulant, it also has a very particular kind of role when it comes to labour, in that it can facilitate greater exertion and with less calories, which of course in capitalism calories cost money most of the time. On the betel, you also use an instance in the supply chain of crafting a betel quid, some people who fry coconut, to illustrate the complicated nature of running a small enterprise where things are not necessarily so clear-cut as formal and informal as a registered sort of workplace or one completely outside the system. Could you maybe give us a little bit more information about that particular story?
Okay, so this was a home factory located within the informal settlement, the squatter settlement, and it was the home of the employer. So she was herself a squatter or a resident of the settlement. And in the morning, they would clear out what was effectively the living room, and that would become the space of a workspace. And in the front of her home, she had this kind of covered area, like a vestibule or a bamboo covered area, where there was a young boy who would chop coconuts. The chopped coconuts were then taken by women who would slice them, and the sliced bits of coconut were then fried. And these fried, they told me that these fried shavings of coconut were then used to flavor betel quids, which is not the standard, but I guess that some people like this. So this was interesting because they had 10 employees at this place, and so 10 workers, and so they would be covered by the social insurance legislation in Myanmar, but in practice, they were not. So the employer was not paying the social insurance payments that are required, nor was she paying the minimum wage for most, other than the fryer. So people were getting below the minimum wage and were not getting various labor protections under the existing labor law, because this was at this kind of gray zone of this an informal. It's in the informal settlement, but it's nonetheless this effectively a factory, or it's a home factory. So this is one of these examples in which the labor of the individuals at the squatter settlement is very much incorporated into capitalist processes, because we can then link this as a part of the betel quid production process into the reproduction of workers, like you said, taking it as a stimulant to work harder.
Okay, in the conclusion of your book, you say that the illiberal practices so often encountered in non-normative labour arrangements, like we've been talking about, cannot be sustainably remedied so long as workers and their families remain so radically dependent on the market. And many people who read your book may find themselves, quite compelled to believe its arguments and to have an emotional response. So, what is one step toward less dispossession, less exploitation, and improvement in the working lives of Myanmar's millions of people, those who are fortunate enough not to live in a conflict zone, mind you, in the current context, which is a post-coup military-ruled Myanmar? Does it have to be a revolutionary response?
Well, Putting aside for the moment the issue of political feasibility, the first step would be to stop the uncompensated confiscation of land, the seizure of land by military and business actors. And this would include where confiscation of land where people lack formal titles to the land. So this has been an ongoing issue even before the coup. And so that would be a necessary step. And the second step would be to break up large plantations, oil palm plantations, for example, that are cultivated on effectively stolen land and return that land to the formal smallholder cultivators. Of course, in the present moment, that is not such an easy thing to do. And even if there was success in ousting the military junta that seized power, it would still be very difficult because under the previous NLD government, there was no indication of any political will to significantly redistribute rural land. Now, I should say that in the early post-independence period, and I think this is important, there was a lot of discussion about land redistribution as centrally important for addressing the economic and livelihood concerns of the bulk of Myanmar's population. And I think it's is extremely important and can be very valuable for people now to revisit a lot of the arguments and writings about land redistribution that were prevalent in the early post-independence period. So that's, in my view, very critical. However, even if the military was ousted and we had to return to something like the NLD rule that was present before the coup, it would still require, in my view, large popular agrarian movements to contest large-scale rural dispossession and to demand some form of land redistribution. I'm not persuaded that the people in the NLD or even in the NUG, I haven't heard anything otherwise, are committed to something like large-scale land redistribution. So for that to come about, in my view at least, it would require a large popular movement from below of smallholder farmers or dispossessed rural dwellers.
Well, there we go. That's a great diagnosis and a very good answer. We can hope for the best. And we always finish Myanmar Musings with a bit of a different kind of question that's not about your research explicitly, which is just for you to offer a recommendation to listeners, people who might have enjoyed the episode. This is your chance to be an influencer.
Okay, well, I was thinking about this, and I would like to recommend a report by Dr. Sailat that came out, I think, a couple of months ago, called Rebellion or Revolution, a Fundamental Question for the Anti-Coup Myanmar Spring. Now, the report's in Burmese, but it's not too difficult if you've for people who are not native Burmese speakers who are nonetheless learning the language. But what's important here is that he really does, I think, a good job in centering issues of class and capitalism. And he argues that any government in Myanmar, including one that might replace the military junta, insofar as it remains dependent on foreign capitalist interests, it will be in certain ways at odds with the interests and the democratic will of Myanmar's peasantry, working class, and poor majority. And so I think this report is very important in really centering questions of capitalism and the kind of economic development model that is based on foreign capitalist investment.
That's a wonderful recommendation, Stephen. Thank you so much. And I hope that people give it a shot reading it, even though it's in Burmese, if you are not a native speaker. And perhaps there'll be a translation into English at some point as well. Thank you for coming on Myanmar Musings and talking about this really important book, and congratulations on its publication.
Thank you very much for having me, and I really enjoyed the conversation.